Hey everybody, I'm Ryan, this is The Will to Make, and today I'm going to show you how I built this key rack. So I started off this project by cutting down a 2x4. I cut two 9.5 pieces, two 7-inch pieces, one 12-inch piece, and one 7-inch piece. Over at the table saw, I trimmed off the one edge of all the boards. I then cut my 9.5 inch and 11-inch pieces to 1 inch wide. And everything else to 3/4 inch wide pieces. Of all these, I cut everything down to a thickness of 3/4 inch. So I was left with 9 9.5 inch pieces, 3 11-inch pieces, 3 12-inch pieces, and 4 7-inch pieces, all at 3/4 inch thick. I laid the 9.5 inch pieces down and set them at a 45-degree angle. I roughly marked out a rectangle and cut off the ends of the outside boards on the bandsaw. These offcuts could then be used on the other side of my board. With all these pieces laid out, I marked out a rectangle and cut off the remaining boards on the bandsaw. Next, I could glue all my pieces together. I laid them out and used some painter's tape to hold everything together. This works pretty well as long as you try to stretch the tape as you apply it. I also clamped a board to the middle to ensure my piece was flat. It could then be set aside to dry. Next, I glued and clamped my 3 shelf pieces together and again clamped a board down the middle to keep it flat. Once everything was dry, I could remove the clamps and tape. On the miter saw, I cut a straight edge. Using that edge, I cut the other side so I had 2 parallel sides. Then using a speed square, I made a perpendicular cut for the long side. I then cut the other long side on the table saw, but somehow managed to not record it. Now I needed to add some trim to all my pieces, and I did so by cutting 45-degree angles and using the back itself to mark them out. Once they were all cut, I used some glue and again held the pieces together with some painter's tape. Then the shelf itself could be removed from its clamps and cut down to the correct size by measuring it off of the back piece. This was also cut on the miter saw. I could then add the trim pieces the exact same way. Once these were dry, I could remove all the tape and give them a quick sanding with 120 grit. Also, I will have links to all the tools and materials I use in the video in the description below, so please check them out. Both pieces had gaps where some of the pieces met, so I mixed up some wood glue and sawdust to fill in the holes. Once dry, I could sand both pieces up to 220 grit. Now I need to attach the shelf to the back, so I first marked out the center of the back and marked where the shelf will go. I then pre-drilled 3 holes through the back and countersunk these holes. I applied some glue and clamped the shelf to the back. I flipped it over and drove in my screws. For finishing, I applied this golden oak wood stain. Once the stain was dry, I applied several coats of spray polyurethane. I bought some hooks to go on this rack, but the screws are too long for the thickness of my boards, so I cut each screw down using a Dremel and metal cutting wheel. I then laid out each hook and marked each hole. I pre-drilled each hole, and with one of the screws that wasn't cut down, I screwed it into each hole. Doing this cuts threads into the wood for my smaller screws to grab onto, since they no longer have a sharp point to cut through the wood. I could then screw down each hook. The last step was to install these wall hanging mounts. They just sit in place and you tap in a tiny nail. I also added one to the bottom of my shelf just to keep it an equal distance off of the wall. Now it was time to hang the rack. I took it inside and using a level held the rack in place while I marked with a pencil roughly where the hooks were on the back of the rack. On these lines, I pre-drilled and installed some screws. Then the rack could be put in place. And with that, this project was complete. Now I have a place to hang all my keys and set my wallet instead of them just sitting on the counter. Please leave a comment of what you would like to see next, and if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time.